All right, let's just make sure everything looks good and sounds good, and then we will start the show. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Just going to double check real quick, and then we will get going with the usual stuff of the day. Okay, looks like we sound good, so let me just share it real quick, and then we will get the show on the road. Okie dokie. All right. Happy Saturday, everyone. Summer's starting off with a bang. Nothing going on this summer. Just a sec. Here we go. Okie dokie. Here we go. We are live. Alrighty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for either joining me live to chat and hang out today and or showing up after the fact and watching later on. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to hang out. I am technically Dr. Patrick Lockwood, but for the purpose of this podcast and for my license and for my career, I'm just Patrick. I'm just a person. This is UnShrink Me. And so UnShrink Me is my weekly podcast that focuses specifically on the issues of mental health, psychiatry, clinical psychology, social work, all the various types of mental health-ish flavored disciplines and all the kind of pseudo normal mental health things that people talk about on a regular basis, popular psychology and things like that. The only goal, the literal only goal of this podcast, if anyone ever has any questions or doubts, is just to create a more informed consumer base. Because, as I say every week, some of the problems with the mental health community, with the clinical community, the treatment industry, the healthcare industry, as it relates to mental health, are on us, the providers. And so my goal is to talk about everything that I think is wrong with the industry in a critical way, joke around from time to time, and try to come up with actionable, concrete takeaways so that everyone can go out there and make more informed decisions about their mental health. So that is the only goal here. If you would like to project onto me any other goal you think I have, such as being rich and famous or whatever, that's totally fine. If you believe I have a political agenda, that's also totally fine. You're welcome to think and believe whatever you want about me. I just don't care. All I care about is that we have fun and that I get to criticize the industry that I am gratefully a part of, because I think people can get help from the various types of mental health care providers that exist. And I think a lot of people are either hurt or wasting their time and money because they're either underinformed or they're being sold a bill of goods by a bunch of either shady or ignorant providers. So that's the whole point of UnShrink Me. Please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, The Psychology Checkup. The name of my weekly podcast is UnShrink Me. And I am not formally, not sponsored by Celsius. Oh, such good shit. So welcome. We have so much to talk about today. Please feel free to chat, chime in, share, add your perspective, challenge something I say, joke around. It's all welcome. All are welcome. I don't care what you look like. I don't care what you believe. If you have an idea or an opinion about these topics, let's chat about it. So today we have a bunch of things to talk about, including personality types and personality disorders, including trauma, including psych meds, including mental health culture, including, what else did I say I was going to talk about? Let me just scroll through my bookmarks here just to make sure. There's just so many things. Yeah, there's just a lot. So we're going to jump right in. Let me get to the post that I'm going to retweet. All right. First, on the college front. Okay. So there's an editorial, I guess, in the Wall Street Journal. And a person named Steve McGuire at SFMCGUIRE posted this about a week ago. And he said there's this author, Pamela Paul, who wrote an article that said college students are using no contact orders to block each other in real life. So the original, at least to my understanding, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, the original reason why many college campuses have what are called no contact orders is because of various types of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and other kinds of obviously illegal behavior that people might engage in while still being students with each other. And so the whole point of a no contact order was to protect people who were verified victims of harassment, assault, so on and so forth on campus, which again, to me makes perfect sense. But then apparently there's been an overusage of these things to, block people who are annoying on campus and things like that. And so here's what I'll say as a guy who happens to also be a professor. There are many different ways in which younger generations are more fragile right now. We have a generation, there's just so many people who talk about this, Jonathan Haidt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to necessarily associate myself with them other than to say, I do believe that there's something that's happened to Gen Z and younger people where they believe that being fragile is valuable or okay or normal. And part of that is because the adults in their life have failed them. And colleges, I believe, are failing people by encouraging no contact orders. So what I would tell you all is, if you have someone on a college campus, if you yourself are on a college campus, if you can't assert yourself, you should figure out how to assert yourself. If you've been truly sexually harassed, etc., then you may need a no contact order. That's perfectly valid, and I support you. So I think it's, there's an epidemic of mental illness on college campuses, and many of the campuses that I know and or am affiliated with have seen a similar kind of problem. So please help people become more anti-fragile. College students in particular, because this is the next generation. That's what I try to do. All right, next up. Where else? What else do we got going on? So much to talk about, so little time. All right. Oh, okay. One of my favorite people on Twitter is this person at No BS Therapist. So I'm just going to post about it real quick so she can see this. Okay, so she's one of my favorite follows. Her handle is at @tweetAtherapist. She posted this 4 days ago. I think it's a really interesting thing to say, and I had my opinion as well. So she put an X, you attract toxic people, X, you choose bad partners, check mark. Toxic people are everywhere. You can't always avoid them. Letting them stay in your life is the issue. So the issue I think I have with this, and I said I agree. Now some people often with trauma or personality disorders choose very sick people more frequently. So why I like this person, the No BS Therapist, is because she is correct that the framing, that you attract toxic people is kind of one-sided. It's like an oversimplification. And for those of you who have followed me for long enough know that I detest oversimplifications because most things in human psychology and human behavior are somewhat complicated and how they're either caused, maintained, etc. So she said she disagreed with the idea that you attract toxic people. And I think for the most part, I can agree that that's an inappropriate oversimplification. I think that there are certain personality types where, people that are, for instance, histrionically organized or people who are narcissistically organized will probably be more frequently appealing to a certain kind of not very well adjusted person. Kind of like if you want to think of a metaphor, now this is a metaphor, this is not meant to be literal, but metaphorically, magnets work by attraction, right? And so there's a gravitational electromagnetic force. And so, certain people who like drama will definitely attract people who are looking to either cause and or be part of drama, right? And so without getting too deep into like personality theory and the psychodynamics of human relationships, what I would say is, if you find yourself constantly in drama-filled relationships, you are probably the problem. You have probably made the choice to not look at why you keep choosing to stick with these people, which is kind of what she said at the end. She said, letting them stay in your life is the issue. So why do you make the choice to let people who are unhealthy for you stay in your life? Now, all of us make compromises in relationships, but that's wildly different than compromising so much that you give up any semblance of peace because you keep allowing really unhealthy people to stay in your life on a regular basis. So I think the word toxic is an oversimplification because, like, yes, we kind of all know it when we see it or whatever, but it's more of a pop psychology thing than a technical thing. I would say that there are very mentally ill people and or very personality disordered people who people call toxic. There are also just very immature people who are not very developed as creatures, and some of them might be personality disordered. But the point of the matter is that the choice to hang out with people who are not doing as well serves some function for you. So if you constantly find yourself in dysfunctional relationships, you're probably getting something out of it. So for instance, some people who are afraid to grow up constantly choose to be around people who are less than healthy. And the idea basically is if I don't hang out with healthier people, then I never really have to grow up, right? Because you kind of water rises to its own level kind of metaphor. Another classic example of this is people that don't understand that they're some kind of mentally ill will often associate with other mentally ill people and just be completely surprised, right? So there's this phrase in the psychodynamic world called histrionic denial. And so people who are histrionically organized are constantly shocked about so many obvious kinds of drama that the outside observer can see from 50 miles away. But because they're organized this way, they actually experience this thing called histrionic denial, where they're otherwise rational people 23 hours of the day, 15 hours of the day. But when a certain kind of interpersonal dynamic enters their life, their denial defense shows up and takes over their conscious processing about so many important self and other needs. And so they interact crazily with people in a way that makes them feel crazy and makes other people feel crazy because they don't know how to get their needs met like an adult. They haven't grown up in that particular need. They're not adults in that way they get that need met. So they're very infantile. And so they resort to like drastic, dramatic things to get their needs met like an infant would. Anyways, so there's various reasons why. I just named 2 specific reasons why people might choose so-called toxic, whatever that actually means, people to be with them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other people are actually toxic. They might just be mentally ill, like you are sort of mentally ill. Or you might just be afraid to grow up more than you currently have grown up. Or it might be dozens of other reasons, right? So you might be in an environment where you find yourself surrounded by mentally ill people like the film industry, the porn industry, the music industry, the performance industry. There's so many industries where mental illness is very attractive and popular because those personality traits and differences serve an adaptive function in those settings. So anyways, a lot to say. Appreciate the grist for the mill. No BS therapist so much. Jonathan Cogbird says, the definition of toxic is extremely important and has become diluted in many circles. Now, diluted is a great pun. I don't know if you meant it, but it's hilarious. Someone who simply holds a different opinion is not necessarily toxic, right? So toxic is a spectrum in toxicology world, in like the science world. So what I would say is, people who are so intense, so present, so opinionated, et cetera, that it's too much. That is kind of the same thing biologically as toxicity. And Jonathan also said, serves a function. Yeah, every choice we make, every pattern of behavior serves an adaptive or maladaptive purpose. And that's why the behaviorist gets so far in life, because when you do something called a functional behavioral analysis, you can actually look at the function the behavior serves, and there's always a function. There's never not a function. Whether it's someone who has a personality disorder, PTSD, major depression, a low IQ, whatever it is, every behavior pattern that's not good for the person serves a purpose. That doesn't mean that the person consciously knows they're engaging in the pattern. They just know that they feel compelled to do whatever the behavior is. Jonathan says, someone who engages in persistent criticism and shifting blame may well be toxic. Yeah, well, persistent anything can be toxic. Persistent positivity is toxic, right? Toxic positivity. Persistent negativity, persistent whatever, persistent anything can be toxic, right? So I think the problem is when we overuse words like toxic, this, that, and the other, we're missing the specific point of the function of the behavior the person has when they choose those people. And that's what I wanted to focus on. All right, we're cooking with gas. All right. There's a post that came out on 5/28 that I think is important. So I want to talk about this real quick. It's not something I have a lot to say about, but I think it's important. Okay. So I don't know this person at all, so I don't have some particular beef or fondness, etc. So this person's handle is @doubt, DOUBT, point, POINT, V2. They say, I have no evidence to support this, but I'm convinced the normalization of therapy has only made American individualism even worse. And so, although not necessarily directly related to mental health, what I will tell you in my 15 years of being in the industry so far, that the mythology around individualism versus collectivism and all that stuff and culture and whatever, like, that's a problem that we do address as clinicians to some degree, because it does relate to various types of diagnostic issues. The greater point I would like to make is, I do agree that when you think of therapy land, which is the world's third worst theme park on the planet, you think of a therapist sitting down with an individual and fixing that individual, helping that individual, talking to that individual, whatever, right? So there's stereotypes about therapy. So it's like, we have to take care of ourselves as individuals and then go be out in the world. And there's a problem with that, because humans are not individual creatures. We have an individual identity, which is important. And so there's no part of me that says individualism is bad. However, the problem we face is that when you think of yourself solely as an individual, if your self-concept only relates to the things that are relevant to you about you, then you're missing out on A, just a bunch of richness in life, but B, most of how most mammals get their needs met is through activity, doing a bunch of things, often with other creatures or in relation to other creatures. So you need relationships to be healthy, is the short story. And so this individualistic focus in therapy is a huge problem. One of the reasons why every place that I've run in my career has a bunch of family therapy involved, or couples therapy if it's needed, is because if you don't help people negotiate their relationships more effectively while they're trying to get healthy, then you're just not really doing your job, right? It's totally fine to do individual therapy. However, most people that do individual therapy are missing out on important opportunities to learn how to assert themselves better in relationships. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it's really, really helpful to have a professional therapist as a mediator in couples therapy or family therapy or whatever it is, or as a consultant for a high school or a business or whatever it is, to help people communicate better and have like someone to guide them through the process. That doesn't mean that everyone who comes to therapy is incapable and must have a therapist who helps them. However, it's been my experience, unfortunately, that a lot of people suck at taking what they're learning in therapy out into the real world. And the reason for that is pretty complicated. I'm sure sometimes it's the therapist's fault, where the therapist sucks at encouraging the person to go practice out in the real world. Also, sometimes it's the patient who is afraid to go practice and hasn't told the therapist that they're struggling to go practice in the real world. And I'm sure there's dozens of shades of gray as to why either the therapist sucks or the patient is struggling to take the practice into the real world. And so for me, I tend to blame the therapist more because ethically speaking, we have a duty to not just like keep people forever in our practice. I think so many therapists do the most unethical thing, which is they have long-term customers because they don't encourage them to actually go individuate and do the things they're doing in therapy in the real world. Now, we can't always know how ready somebody is to go be more assertive in the real world or deal with their attachment stuff or their childhood stuff or their depression in the real world. It's impossible to objectively know. There's no scientific research that says when patients' scores on a PHQ-9 are this, they can go practice these skills better. That's all bullshit. There's no amount of measurement-based care that can actually specifically scientifically tell us for a particular patient. It's always clinical judgment. It's always subjective. But what I would encourage everyone to consider is if you have patients under your care for more than a year or two, you're probably doing something wrong. There's probably some need that you are getting met, be it personal, emotional, financial, as a clinician, that's not actually helping the patient because you're probably not encouraging them to individuate. You probably believe they're less capable than they probably actually are. The vast majority of people are actually 10 times more capable than you think they are. Now, that's a random, arbitrary number, whatever, but I can just tell you, knowing so many psychodynamic people and behaviorists and like private practice therapists that like it's a business. And so people are not always clear on their motives. Professionals are especially not always clear on their motives. And so it's not that I'm saying that they're all frauds or whatever. I'm just saying that you should be able to individuate. If you're doing good therapy, if you have a good clinical relationship, you know what you're doing, you're aware of countertransference, you're aware of your bias, you should not need to keep people forever to help them and eventually they grow up and they leave you after a year or two. That's bad. I think that most people probably can get well quicker. There are some rare cases where people have very severe, very deep wounds and things like that, but that's very different than the vast majority of people that come to therapy who do not need to be in therapy forever in order to get healthy. So, for what it's worth. All right. Let's talk about my frenemy, Justin Garson. I don't know. I don't really know this guy, so I'm just joking. Justin Garson, I'm not sure how to say your name. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong. Put out a couple of posts that I'd like to talk about this week on the podcast. I'll start with the one from May 31st. So he said, I'm going to discuss this right now. Okay. So on May 31st, Justin said, his handle, by the way, is at Justin_GARSON. Psychiatry's greatest challenge is grappling with the fact that mental health, like diabetes and hypertension, is shaped by our choices, which is true. Yet, decades of pharmaceutical programming have convinced us we're helpless against these brain disorders, and that saying otherwise is stigma. So he's correct that there's this really weird false dichotomy where it's like patients are these helpless morons, right? Like if you challenge medications at all, you're hurting the poor, weak, feeble patients who desperately need these meds. It's like, it's not black and white. So I do agree with Justin in the sense that like this false dichotomy does exist. There are psychiatrists who are activists who are like, anyone who criticizes us is just a bad faith person, and they're idiots and they have some biases they don't understand. But also, Justin, I would say that, you know, my experience working with very mentally ill people And so I'm going to qualify what I specifically mean by that so people are clear in both my intention and my goal. So as a clinical psychologist in private practice, family therapy, couples therapy, running treatment programs, etc., and based upon what I know about the literature. So this is where I'm drawing this information from. So there are subsets of people with various types of diagnoses that need different types of interventions and are helped by them per both the research and my clinical experience. And so here's what I will tell you. There's all sorts of variability. It's a spectrum, right? So let's just take bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder, thank God, is extremely rare. It's very rare. Maybe 1%, maybe 2% of the population. It's extremely rare. Most people on the planet have never truly met someone with bipolar. Many people who are misdiagnosed with bipolar are medicated, and it's a shame that that happens to them, and it shouldn't happen, right? So many people that have genuine bipolar, which means that they have intense, like second and third standard deviation grandiosity, second and third standard deviation of the population racing thoughts, rapid speech, flight of ideas, hyperproductivity. Although it's fair to say there's a spectrum of productivity, there's a spectrum of grandiosity, there's a spectrum of all these symptoms in the DSM-5-TR of what's considered a manic episode. It's also 100% true that the people on the second, third standard deviation end of the spectrum with these traits are in serious trouble if they're not medicated. I promise you. And so I've had the experience of working with people who genuinely have bipolar disorder. It's not some fake label that I randomly threw on them or my psychiatrist randomly threw on them. It's like months of being patient and months off of drugs and other meds, and you saw that the grandiosity persisted despite the medication, and the racing thoughts persisted and were causing functional consequences in their day-to-day life. You know, I've had patients do absolutely antisocial things because their symptoms of bipolar were overcoming their executive functions, right? I've had people who were so grandiose that they made impulsive decisions that ended them in the psych hospital. Not because society is bad, but because they did things that could get themselves and other people hurt. And so I'm here to tell you that those people, as much as I hate psych meds for the vast majority of people, I can tell you that I love it when people are not at risk of harming themselves and other people because their symptoms are out of control. Because these otherwise brilliant, like I've had 3 people I can think of off the top of my head in my career so far, who, if they weren't on meds, they did highly self-destructive things because of impulsivity, not shame, but impulsivity, grandiosity, and disinhibition. And it's not because they're just abnormal. These are people at the third standard deviation of life. So, Justin, what I will tell you is that I agree that the people who push back on the skeptics of psychiatry are usually just trying to protect themselves. And if you can see no world where psych meds are useful, then I think there's a problem, personally speaking. Okay. I'm going to back-to-back Justin for the sake of keeping the conversation rolling. This one might take a little bit longer, so buckle up. So same person, Justin, at Justin_GARSON, 3 days ago, and I just have so much to say. Okay, Justin, let's get into it. So this is one where I feel a little more protective of people, even more than the prior conversation. So let's talk about it. So 3 days ago, he said, the worst thing you can do, which I have lots to say about that starting phrase. He said, and I quote, the worst thing you can do to a person is convince them their mind or personality is a symptom of a disorder. It's morally hideous. So I'm going to say it one more time so everyone hears very clearly what he said. I'm going to try and read it with no inflection of any kind. He said, "The worst thing you can do to a person is convince them their mind or personality is a symptom of a disorder. It's morally hideous." My response was, sometimes it's true. If you believe there's no such thing as a personality disorder, then you're in trouble. And he said, "I don't believe in personality disorders. So far, I've done okay in life." And I said, "Well, you don't have to believe in them. They're real. I assume you would agree that people have personality traits that are on a spectrum," and he chose not to reply. So let's talk about this as straightforwardly as possible, because this is a really, really, this is a challenging one. And it's not challenging like emotionally or something like that, but like I think most people in the popular discourse of things never really fully are taught to understand the mind, variation, and behavior patterns very thoughtfully. Parents don't do that, teachers don't do that, etc. And that's fine, because some of this is only really relevant at the level of clinical psychopathology. However, some of it's relevant in real life. So this is where I take my duty as a clinical psychologist very seriously, as a professor, etc., because, you know, I care enough about the profession doing a good job and not hurting people, right? That's why I started this podcast. So I also strongly, firmly believe that so many people are over-pathologized. Behavior patterns that are normal are over-pathologized. Just to give an example, I'm going to talk about something that was sent to me that I think is absolutely stupid. So there's this post from some influencer on Instagram at JMT Counseling, and the title is "Rejection Sensitive Dysphoria." And let me explain how stupid that is. So the explanation for rejection sensitive dysphoria on this Instagram post by JMT Counseling is an intense emotional reaction to real or perceived rejection or criticism. It's common in people with ADHD and can feel overwhelming or sudden. So here's what I'll tell you. That's absolutely 100% bullshit, because everyone hates being rejected. Not one person is totally happy to be rejected, unless you're maybe like kind of on the masochistic side of the spectrum. But the vast majority of people on the planet literally do not like being rejected and are on a spectrum of more or less sensitive when they're being rejected or criticized. So some people are less sensitive to being criticized, and some people are more sensitive to being criticized. But the idea that it's a special kind of unique construct, rejection sensitivity has been around for decades and decades and decades. And it is not unique to people who are neurodivergent, people with ADHD, autism, or whatever. And anyone who tells you that it's unique to a particular group of people is full of shit and is a grifter, and please ignore them. So here's the deal. There's all sorts of crap like that out there that is trying to get people clicks and likes and reaffirmed by some online community. And that's totally fine. But Mark's like, "I love being rejected." No, you don't, Mark. Don't lie. But what I will tell you is, for all the pseudoscience and all the horseshit that is out there that like smells like psychology or smells like clinical psychology or psychiatry, there are valid ideas in the world of psychology. And I think most people, even if like Justin is the most extremely critical version of this, who says it's all not real, basically what he's saying is there's really no such thing as mental illness, which I can understand why people say that, because so many people are misdiagnosed or over-pathologized. So I am sympathetic to the idea that my industry should have far fewer customers. I would love it if all of the worried well who come to therapy would go eat better, exercise better, have more sex, join a church or something, join a gym, hang out with your friends more, get off your fucking phone, go do a bunch of stuff that's going to make you feel better. Maybe quit that terrible job and get a better job. I don't specifically know, but there are a great many worried well who are on these therapy apps and who think they're diagnosed with this and whatever, but they're just losers, or they're lonely, or they're bored, or they don't have a lot of friends, or they're not prioritizing their sleep, or whatever thousands of potential things it is. It's not mental illness. It's just they are maladjusted to life. And life also is very difficult and complicated and stupid. So because of all of that, I can totally side with Justin and say, yes, so many people are diagnosed when they shouldn't be, or they're misdiagnosed. And that's all bad. And it's terrible for people because some of these diagnoses follow people for life and get them put on meds they never need to be on. So many kids should never be on SSRIs or ADHD meds or whatever it is. And they're screwing up their brains from time one. And that's terrible. And so I'm 100% with Justin in all of those cases. Where I lose him, where I am against Justin, is the idea that there's no such thing as pathology. Right? Either you don't believe in the normal curve, that the normal curve doesn't exist, there's no variation in how a person's built or functions, or you do. And if you believe that there's variation, there's such a thing as like 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations outside the normal, then you believe that maybe there's a way of functioning that's not really adaptive for people, which means you probably think illness might exist. Let me just check the chat before I get back to my rambling. Mark says, if I were to make an observation, I might say that the fear of rejection is a bigger problem for individuals through techno-modernity that are isolated. I mean, that's probably true. I could see that being true. What I would argue is that the fear of rejection is probably amplified artificially because of social media, which I talk about in my book over there, The Fear Problem. Mark says, are we maladjusted or is modernity maladjusted to our nature or both? Well, in my book, The Fear Problem, which you can listen to for free on YouTube, you never have to buy it, I encourage you to give it a listen. I say that society is maladjusting us and that society is not well designed to deal with how we are built. That's what I say. That doesn't mean that some people are not maladjusted or ill or have a genetic predisposition. It's just that I think we currently all live lives that are better than they ever could be, more comfortable, rich, etc. for most people. The problem that I think exists is we take for granted these luxuries. We take for granted how good our lives are. We also take for granted how damaging these things can be to us. Technology, comfort, processed foods, all the things that, like, if you take them for granted and you treat them as if it's no big deal, then you're not being mindful about your needs as a person. So we're complicated creatures living in a very complex society. So we need to take that more seriously, which is why I wrote the book. And I have more books that I'd like to write, etc. when I have more time. Anyways, so yes, Mark, I'm with you. So let's go back to personality, because Justin Garson's post, I'm just going to read it again in case people are just now joining or he said, just to reiterate, so I can finally get to this. He said the worst thing you can do to a person is convince them their mind or personality is a symptom of a disorder. It's morally hideous. So I take issue with the phrase, the worst thing you can do, because I can think of hundreds of things that are far worse. The worst thing you can do to a person is probably murder them. That's probably the worst thing you can do to most people. Probably the second worst thing you can do to most people is like cut off a limb. Probably the third worst thing you can do to people is like malign them socially for the rest of their life. I think probably the fourth worst thing you could do to people is torture them endlessly, like in those terrible Saw movies or whatever. I can just think of dozens and dozens and dozens of worse things other than like telling them they have a mental illness. But maybe that's my bias as a provider. I don't know. So first, the worst thing is just bait. It's just engagement bait. And he got me. Fair enough. But then let's break apart the second sentence. The worst thing you do to a person in this clause is convince them, number one, convince. Number two, convince them their mind or their personality is a symptom of a disorder. So automatically I know he's not a clinician or a scientist in psychology or whatever, because specifically, no one in our profession is convincing them their mind is a disorder. No one's convincing them that their personality is a symptom of a disorder. So ethical clinicians, research psychologists, study symptoms, which are specific patterns of thinking and behavior, not their person's entire mind. So what he's doing is all or nothing thinking, and that's pathological in and of itself. So no one's mind is a disorder. No one's personality is in and of itself a disorder. And probably because most people don't understand personality variation, they don't really get it. Now, when people are overdiagnosed, just like I said before, that's morally not good. That's bad. I don't like that. It's disgusting. I hate my profession for doing that. And there's a lot of people who are described as having a personality disorder when they actually don't have one. So let's talk about this, because I feel compelled to be as clear for the audience, right? Because the whole point of this is I want to create a more informed consumer base so that if you do believe that you need support of a professional kind, you can have a clearer picture of what's going on so that you aren't unnecessarily hurt by scammy people out there or just garden variety, ignorant, normal people who think they're doing a good job. So here's my belief, and this is based upon just personality research going back to the 1980s, which goes back even further in history, where we have pretty interesting, pretty solid research back to the 50s. So personality theory is not some monolith. There's not like one model of personality differences that exist. There are many models that have existed in history that have helped us understand variation and patterns of human behavior. Some patterns of human behavior are not actually patterns, and some patterns of human behavior actually are patterns. And so if you actually took the time to understand, for instance, called the Big Five, right? So the 5-factor model of personality is literally, not metaphorically, not me exaggerating, it's the most robust model of personality that has ever existed. And so there's all these Freudian views of personality, there's these other cultural views of personality, but then there's the 5-factor model of personality. And this model of personality has been studied in cultures all over the planet that do not share similar values, beliefs, habits, languages, and still we find a 3, 4, or 5-factor solution that's very similar to Western samples. And so it is literally the most culture fair, non-discriminatory model of personality on the planet. And so what I will tell you is, it's very important to say that although these models are robust, it does not mean that these are the be-all, end-all of human existence. Understanding your personality is just one facet of how you function as a person. And so it's really important to be clear that personality organization and style are not the same thing as personality pathology. Those couldn't be more disparate problems. So how you're organized, right, your tendencies for reaction are not the same things as tendencies for overreaction or underreaction. So personality style is not at all the same thing as personality pathology. In some cases, those things overlap, and that's totally important to talk about separately. But in most cases, most people fall on a continuum, a spectrum, if you want to think of it like the normal curve, however you want to think of it, it's literally the case, not metaphorically the case, that everyone has a personality organization. We are not random collections of tendencies and habits. No human being in any culture on the planet is a purely culturally constructed person. Likewise, no human being on the planet is a purely biologically driven robot who is forever foreclosed to functioning because of their personality or something. So, there are many interwoven variables that affect how a person shows up in a habitual way. One of those variables is intelligence or IQ. Another one of those variables is your personality style or organization. Another one of those variables is your culture. Another one of those variables is your age and related biological factors that affect you, like your hormones and things like that, your metabolic process. And so if you just take those four things I listed, those four things probably account for a large chunk of the variance in human behavior patterns. But that's not the whole story, because then there's this thing called situational context. And so that situational context thing is wildly important, and any ethical clinician, any ethical researcher should be paying extremely close attention. This is why I advocate for family therapy and couples therapy, by the way, because people are not isolated individuals. People are complicated social creatures. We are reactive beings to the world around us. And so it might be true that we have these personality traits which are fairly robust over time and don't change drastically over time, as the 5-factor model research shows. But social context is extremely important, because, just to use myself, I'm a fairly disagreeable creature. I would score very low on most 5-factor model tests of agreeableness. And that's not good or bad. It's just what it is. And there's nothing I can do about that. But what I can do about that is be aware of my basic tendency to be argumentative and not be particularly empathic and interested in the needs and well-being of other people. So the question would be, in what ways is that trait most useful and not useful? In what ways is that trait going to be problematic and maladaptive for me? In what context and situations? And in what situations is it no big deal, or is it great? Right? For me as a professor, being fairly disagreeable is actually very useful. And the reason is because if I have an idea, if my colleagues have an idea, if my students have an idea, I will help them clarify and sharpen their idea by asking questions or pushing back on things so that they think about it more clearly and they can fire test the idea. But at a coffee shop, I'm not going to argue with the barista about the tip. Now, Justin might say, well, you must not be very disagreeable then, because you're not just arguing all the time. But that's not what it means to be temperamentally disagreeable. And so it's really important to be clear about what personality traits actually are. And I have an entire lecture that I do about this, and I can create a video if you all want at some point. But what I will say is that if we don't look at the normal curve, first, second, third standard deviation of personality differences, and understand that the people that are at standard deviation 2 and 3 live a very different life and have baseline tendencies that are very different than people at the 50th percentile, then you're a moron. And the reason is because nature is interested in variation, because variation helps with fitness, etc. And so sometimes the people at the second and third standard deviation have a very hard time fitting in life in most environments, right? It's extremely difficult for temperamentally very, very narcissistic people to fit in most environments. They need to be in very specific kinds of environments to thrive. Now, does that mean that they're just bad, broken, disgusting people? No. People with severe narcissism, like the 99th percentile of trait narcissism, often do amazing things, like they're great musicians or great artists or performers or whatever. And they do amazing things for the world. But personally, they're miserable. They have horrible romantic relationships. They don't respect themselves or other people. They hate themselves. And so there's so much variation in how they show up in the world, because generally speaking, those traits are triggered by contexts that are useful, but they're also triggered by other contexts, because your personality traits can't not be triggered sometimes. And so they need to learn to manage their temperamental differences to function better. That's what people with personality differences should be doing. Whether or not it's just personality variation, or it's true pathology where you score at a very high percentile and you have no insight and awareness of it. So I'm going to let that breathe for just a second. I'm going to go to the chat here. Mark says, preach. I made this a good criticism of modern narratives is that they ignore good research from the 60s, 70s, and 80s onwards. Yes, it's true. Many people who read modern research have no clue the history of the research on any of these concepts, whether it's PTSD, depression, self-esteem, what a bullshit concept, or personality. Like, there's going back to Gordon Allport, decades and decades and decades ago, we've been talking about the concept of personality. And so there's so much to say about human variation, personality variation, trait variation. Like, most people would look at any species of animal and see that different species of animals have different traits. And those traits, they've usually inherited, which became necessary over time through generations and iterations of being in environments where those traits were honed to be useful, right? And so no one thinks it's absurd or insane to think that animals have different types of traits. Humans do too. Just because we're the most flexible and plastic creatures on the planet doesn't mean we don't have, variation in traits that are real biological things in some cases, and some things more socially constructed. So, yeah, I completely agree. And Mark says, we need to include as many vectors as possible and recognize that they will intersect with complex environmental conditions. Yes, I wish you would shout that from the rooftops, Mark. That the reality of human psychology is we are both biological creatures with temperaments and needs that are not malleable to the environment, but also we have some psychological variations that are more malleable. And then we have some features of our psychology that are much more malleable and socially contingent. So I'm going to say that one more time so that everyone in the nosebleed seats can hear it. Human beings are complicated, and some of human psychology is much less malleable, including IQ and personality traits. Most people with more extreme variations of IQ and personality traits are not very malleable in those regards with regard to their psychology. Most people also have features of their human psychology, such as mood states, etc., which are much more malleable and socially, environmentally contingent. And then other people and other human psychology facets are very socially flexible and contingent. And so what I'm talking about with regard to mental illness is only category one. To me, as a professional, as a professor, mental illness only falls into the category of the not very malleable problems that require either management, lifestyle management, in some rare cases meds, in some rare cases therapy. I'm not talking about the somewhat malleable things or the very malleable things. So if you're stressed out because of something more malleable, like grief or life circumstance, that's valid, and maybe even therapy could be helpful. But I don't think you're mentally ill just because you're grieving or you're going through some life adjustment. That's not mental illness. That's just maladjustment to a shitty circumstance. That's life sucks disorder, if you want to think of it like that. So just to be clear to literally everybody, there are 3 points on the spectrum of human psychological variation. Some human psychology is over here. It's very malleable. It's flexible across time and circumstances. It's very situationally dependent, as like Brian Lowry, for instance, would probably agree. But then in the middle of the spectrum over here are the things that are somewhat biologically loaded and less environmentally flexible. And then over here on the far end of the spectrum are the people with the second and third standard deviations of differences in mood reactivity, mood regulation, personality traits, and variation. And so that group of people is very different. And it's not just culture, which has made them very different. There are antisocial organizations of personality in every culture on the planet. And if you don't believe me, go there. You will find people who are more antisocial, callous, and unempathetic. You will find people who are more narcissistic in every culture on the planet. They exist, and it's not just all socially contingent. And so, Justin, if you ever want to have a real conversation about this, you bring your data and I'll bring mine, and we can talk about what you think you know and what I think I know. But what I will tell everybody is that I have never met someone who truly had bipolar 1 who would live an amazing life completely off of meds. It's never happened. It's just, I can't think of an example of any severely mentally ill person who is perfectly fine without some extra supports and lifestyle changes compared to the average person at the 50th percentile. And you can think of so many popular examples in the music industry, in the performing arts industry, so many brilliant people, right? Like I think about people that I absolutely love and adore, like Robin Williams, probably one of my favorite people on the planet. Rest in peace, God rest your soul, Robin Williams. Like probably one of the bigger characters in my childhood in terms of the media I consume, stand-up comedy when he's coked out of his mind, and the movies he made. And he's just genuinely a good person from everything I heard from the people I know who knew him and everything I read. And it's just like, here's a beautiful soul who struggled severely with obvious mental health issues, neurological issues, and drug issues, such that he probably, lived a shorter life than he needed to, but no one can really say what's supposed to happen, obviously. I don't want anyone to die, obviously. But, this was a very ill person. And many periods in his life, his drug use and his personality differences and his mood differences affected his ability to, be the dad he wanted to be and be the spouse he wanted to be. And then the end of his life with his neurological condition. It's like these are real things that affected his ability to have the life that he wanted to have. He was still a very brilliant person that most people around him loved. And his life was cut short because of these various types of illnesses he struggled with. Especially, I think, if I recall reading correctly, the neurological illness he was struggling with. So what I care about is being honest about the fact that there's a spectrum of variability. And there's a very severe end of the spectrum, that second and third standard deviation in life, where you genuinely are neurologically different and you do not have some like culturally loaded variation. Like once you meet someone at the second and third standard deviation of trait narcissism, you can't not know what that feels like. They feel literally different, and it's not just an American thing. It's not a Western thing. You can find these people in every corner of the planet. And so it's important to be clear that personality variation is a spectrum. Most people, it's the normal curve. Most people fall in that first standard deviation, the first 68%, basically. But it's genuinely the case that the people who go outside of that first standard deviation live very different lives, and it's not just culturally loaded. Culture affects how these people are treated and seen and unfortunately demonized. But personality disorders are real, and they need help usually to be managed. You can't cure them. You can sometimes treat them and help them get insight so they can find better niches to live in, or they can find new ways of managing their variations, their extreme reactivity or lack of reactivity. And some of the diagnoses in the book suck and are not very valid, right? And so like many of the cluster C conditions I don't think are real things. But many of the cluster B things obviously are, and they serve some adaptive purpose in some niches, and they're completely maladaptive in other niches. And so That's about as rational approach to it as possible. And Justin, if you ever want to chat, I'm totally interested, and I'll treat you with as much respect as you treat me, basically. And I don't think that we would have a bad conversation. I actually think it'd be a great conversation because I think 60% of the time I'm in agreement with you, Justin, that people are overdiagnosed, and the vast majority of the people that end up in the mental health care system probably don't need to be there. They probably need to adjust their lifestyle and sleep and all these things. And it's genuinely the case that they don't need to be there. They need to do a bunch of other things that don't require or necessitate therapy. Mark says, I'd watched that conversation. Please elaborate on cluster C. So the old school DSM-4 decade ago, looked at personality variation in 3 clusters. So the cluster A folks were the paranoid, psychotic personality styles. The cluster B folks were the dramatic, evocative, histrionic personality styles. And then the cluster C folks were the anxious and avoidant personality styles. And so those general clusters are somewhat true. And I think the research on cluster B is a little more clear and conclusive than the research on cluster A and cluster C. And so cluster C typically includes obsessive compulsive personality style, avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in the research on those conditions. And so a lot of people think they're not real, and they use that to discredit all personality theory, which is, again, fair in many cases. But the problem is, once you've met someone who truly could fit the criteria for borderline or antisocial or narcissistic or histrionic, you know it's a real thing. And it's not culturally contingent. These people live like this every day of the week, every month of the year, whether they're in New York, Miami, LA, Missouri, wherever. So, yeah. So that's our hour. There's so much more to say, so many more things to go through. Let me just double check the things I bookmarked real quick. Yeah, there's more to talk about for sure. But we will talk about it, I think, next week. Let's talk about it next week. Lots of cool stuff to talk about next week. Well, thanks everyone for coming out to watch and chat. Please like, share, and subscribe and help this get a little more popular so we can get more people some healthy criticism and skeptical thinking around, mental health. What is bullshit? What is valid? What is useful? What is not useful? I hope everyone who watches this and hears this understands that although my tone may be something or I may sound overly critical, the reason I am this way is because it's genuinely the case. I'm not making this up. It's genuinely the case that perfectly ordinary people think that something is wrong with them, and then they go to therapy, and then a therapist who is either ignorant or just mediocre confirms that for them. And so what I never want to have happen is I never want people who are not actually genuinely ill to feel like they have to go see a therapist just because they're stressed out or they're going through some life adjustment thing. And it's not to say that therapy can't help you. It is just to say that genuinely speaking, most of the time, you don't need therapy if you're part of the worried well class. And so there's a great many people that go to therapy who don't need it. So my goal is to protect the consumers from the profession and from the gurus and the influencers and all those people who believe that they're so smart or so wise that they know exactly what the truth is. My thing is, I don't know exactly what the truth is, but I can tell you from my years of clinical work, my years of being a professor, looking through the research, I can be appropriately precise and critical and skeptical of the bullshit, like rejection sensitivity dysphoria that was talked about today. I will tell you all very clearly that there's no such thing as rejection sensitivity dysphoria, because it's like saying the blue sky is blue. Yes, if you're sensitive to rejection, you're going to have a negative or aversive reaction. So what I will tell you all is my goal, no matter how I sound, what I look like, how many times I burp, the whole goal is just to help people become a little more skeptical, a little more critical, and just maybe a little more accepting of the fact that maybe you're different. Some people are just different and not ill, kind of like Justin is advocating for. And so my goal is to protect the consumer base and to criticize the profession. And just to give a shout out and a little bit of a preamble, there's a young lady who just wrote an op-ed. I'm going to talk about this in my closing here. There's a young lady who wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know. Wall Street Journal. Let me see if I can find it. Sorry. Okay. Naomi Best is her name on Twitter, and her handle is at NaomiEppsBest. So Naomi is a grad student, or was a grad student, I don't know, at Santa Clara University, and she wrote this op-ed about her human sexuality class where the professor, I think, required her, if I understand the story correct, to discuss her sexual history. And it is literally, not metaphorically, it's literally unethical, per the American Psychological Association, to force people to self-disclose. We are not allowed as professors to force our students to say or do something of a personal nature. It's not our job. And so she's putting her future career on the line to criticize this class. And what I will tell you is that her experience of being subjected to unethical behavior is not rare. In graduate psychology in particular, many professors see themselves as gurus or as brilliant or insightful or so caring or so smart or so thoughtful or some superlative thing or so ethical or whatever it is, that they are the moral standard bearers and it is their ethical job to do the perfect thing, which is fucking bullshit. All of us make mistakes. And this is a mistake this professor made, in my opinion. So what I will tell you all very clearly is that the mental health profession, graduate psychology, clinical psychology, psychiatry, whatever degree level, doesn't even matter, is not as healthy as you think it is. And so we need to be appropriately skeptical of the people that say they're here to help, because many people are just ordinary people. But remember, when somebody is ordinary, that means that they are not particularly smart, not particularly insightful, and not particularly healthy. So there's a lot of ordinary people in therapy land, the world's worst theme park, who are ordinary, which means that they are probably on average either not helpful or potentially harmful. And then there are people who are more smart, more insightful. They've done more of their own work. They're more aware of their countertransference and their bias. And so those people might be on average healthier, more capable of being clinically helpful, etc. So what I want to encourage everyone to consider is that the things that I criticize, the intensity with which I talk about these things, is not because therapy's fine and I'm just particularly sensitive or something. I'm actually the opposite of sensitive. I'm just fucking fed up with all the people that I've seen in my career who were harmed by providers. I've been working in rehab land, or as I call it, Rehabistan, for 15 years. And so many patients were misdiagnosed by former psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists. So many patients had boundary violations with their clinicians. And it's just disgusting to me. And so many people try to rationalize their bad behavior. And so the reason I do this podcast is because no one is speaking up about accountability in this industry. No one cares about all the people getting hurt. It is just a talking point at conferences and conventions. And it's almost never talked about. If you go to a professional therapy conference, very, very rarely do they have papers and presentations on the harms of the profession. And if you don't believe me, Go look at the American Psychological Association's conference presentations. Less than 5 or even 1% have to do with the harms the professions cause. And I will tell you that there's far more harm out there than there is that you think. So please share this podcast. Let's get more informed consumers. Let's make sure people get what they need from professionals and can sniff out bullshit and gurus and coaches and all the flim-flammers who have a quick and easy, simple understanding of who you are, which is absolute horseshit. So please support me, help me get the word out, and let's create a healthier society by being more appropriately skeptical and focusing on the things that we can actually influence and take care of. And let's, please take care of your health. Please do the things that are good for you. Get the sleep you need, eat the food you need to eat, have the fun you need to have, assert yourself in relationships. Please take good care of yourself because you deserve it. So, that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming out. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you all next week. No joke this week. But again, thanks everyone. And I appreciate you. And